to convey my thanks to the Center for inviting me for this talk. In particular, I want to thank JU, but also Veronica Kusumayati, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and to Mary and Lydia, everyone in the center. Thank you so much for the introduction, JU. Yeah, so this is part of a continuation of my first book on the managerial state, but it actually is a bit of another project. Actually, I'm actually doing something on the history of Indonesian oil since the late 19th century up to the 1980s, 90s period, and also in connection to that, actually discussing on topics of corruption and how that sort of plays into the oil industry. I'm doing research on corruption with the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, so I've been doing that for a couple of years now. But this is part of that book that focuses on a very important part in the 70s when the shifting changes were occurring in the context of Indonesia, but also at a global level. So my talk is on the oil crisis and the global governance in Indonesia. So I'm going to give a bit of a context. So this is about trying to sort of relook or sort of trying to understand the 70s and position Indonesia in the broader narrative of the 70s. So I think there's two things to say about in the context of the 70s. First of all, it was a period of sort of re-emerging forms of global governance, and this really occurred, after the collapse of the European global empires, of the colonial empires in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But also, if you look at the period of the 1950s and 1960s, where the 1960s was called the development decade, there was an effort or a context in which technical aid from the West was supposed to help the process of modernization in the global South. But by the end of the 60s, or by the mid to the end of the 60s, there was a feeling that this has sort of failed, right? So the development decade failed. Democracies were falling all over the place in the global South. There were rising dictatorships and so forth. And then if you look at the 1970s, then it was a period of sort of a more intense engagement and dialogue between the global South and the global North. And you can see that in the context in the emergence of stuff like the G77, the global, the caucus of the South in the UN, the new international economic order that it sort of tried to focus, but also OPEC, right? The way in which the global South tried to maneuver or tried to engage in determining global governance in the 70s. And this occurred in the context of just emergence of new forms of global movements, the environmental movement. And this picture, of course, is the 1972 Stockholm Environmental Conference. The indigenous movements also had its roots there, which in a lot of ways predicates on this sort of dialogue between the North and South. So the story of the struggle of the global South, in a way, clash with also this narrative of the rise of neoliberalism, right? And as we can see, that the transition from this sort of North-South dialogue in the 70s was superseded then with the discussion on financialization and neoliberalism in the 70s, and especially in the 80s, with in effect the third world debt crisis, like and OPEC's sort of absence in determining oil price. So the efforts in the 70s panned out differently because by the 80s, neoliberalism had sort of succeeded, and it's really a sort of reshaping of that global governance from a Western or from an American kind of power structure. Yeah. So, but in this context, then, you know, this shift towards neoliberalism is a global phenomenon. But the discussion here I want to put forth is what happens in these individual countries and what happens if we talk about it in the context of Indonesia. So these changes occur within the context of a changing economic order, at which was really facilitated or was really the result of a major shift in the flow of oil, right? As a result of the rise of the flow of money, which is really the result of the shift in the price of oil, right? And the control of oil itself. Now, in the U.S., in 1971, this was the height of peak oil production. Before later on in the 2000s, when fracking and stuff, so that now in America is of course the biggest producer of oil again. But for a long time, especially, this was the height of America's sort of influence in oil production, and this led to, in 1973 to 74, the end of the gold standard, the dollar. So it's sort of the end of Keynesian economic order, right? And this was also precipitated, as I said, with that sort of global south kind of movement, especially in the context of OPEC determining oil price, right? So OPEC determining the posted price, which, as we knew, then resulted in the oil crisis, the increase in oil significantly several times throughout the period of the 70s, and resulting in sort of a massive outflow of money from the north to oil-producing countries. So you have small countries like Bahrain, who then had like $20 to $40 billion of oil coming in every year, and it had only 20,000 people. You know, so this massive transfer of wealth from the north to the south. But as you know, the discussion on that context, on the shift towards neoliberalism, is that if you look at sort of Caleb Wellham's discussion on financialization as a result of oil, or Timothy Mitchell's discussion on the emergence of economics in the 70s to explain or not to explain, but sort of to legitimize the shift towards a neoliberal system, is a story of financialization of oil. That oil price were determined not by oil producers anymore, which OPEC tried to do, but by the 1980s by the futures market, and particularly by New York, like the New York exchange market. So, but in that sense, it's about wresting control from the particular countries of the global south back to the north, or back to Washington, so that the oil futures market by the early 80s determined oil price. Looking at it this way, neoliberalism is an epoch on the emergence of an American financial empire and how that empire is expressed and enabled. But Indonesia is an interesting part of that story, but it sometimes is not discussed because we are a sort of minor oil player. But its position is actually quite central during this period. So I want to just then sort of focus on, and I'll start with the story of Indonesian oil. So Indonesia was one of the first areas in the globe to develop an oil extraction industry, and it had, it was at the time it was of course part of the Dutch East Indies, and by the end of the 19th century, several players within the Dutch economy sort of played that, and then it rose by the 20th century. The Royal Dutch Shell, what would become the Royal Dutch Shell would emerge and would sort of maintain a monopoly of that oil production. it was or had been sort of an active ground for many of the so-called Seven Sisters, the global oil companies that controlled much of oil production and selling during prior to the OPEC, prior to the 1970s. So and which was part of that sort of the imperial global oil system. And so by the end of the colonial period, Indonesia had like the fifth largest global producer of oil, despite only having 2% of global oil deposits. So one of the primary reasons why Indonesia was able to become such a major part of that was because it was a major center for investments by quite a number of the Seven Sisters. Now, after independence, there was a shift in ownership of oil, and this led to gradually, because our story is about Pertamina, the national oil company in the 1970s. Right? So, so I'm going to talk about the rise of Pertamina here. So before 1968, the name was not Pertamina, the national oil company, the name was Pertamina, and there were three national oil companies that were given the rights to extract oil in Indonesia post-independence. But this person is very important because he became the head of Pertamina, and he also played a central role in within the oil industry globally in the 70s. So his name is Ibnu Sutowo, who was a medical doctor who had graduated from East Java, from Surabaya in 1938, and he was posted to South Sumatra in the late 1930s, early 40s, which was the most important oil province in the Dutch East Indies, and developing good relations with Indonesian nationalists within the sort of South Sumatran oil circuits. Now, during the revolution, Sutowo was under a group of nationalists under a guy named Akagani, who took control of oil facilities because he controlled a lot of the youth groups in South Sumatra. Now, he did then later on return them to Shell and Stanvac, but the fact that he effectively took control of the oil industry meant that a lot of the people within that, people under Akagani's group, were in the oil industry. So when Sutowo in the 50s, in 1957, the army wanted to take over an oil facility in North Sumatra. Ibnu Sutowo, because of his relationship with groups in South Sumatra, he was the one chosen, and General Nasution actually personally asked him to take over the company, take over the sites. And what's really important with Ibnu is that he is a very capable businessman, and so he took over a site in North Sumatra, which was previously owned by Shell. It was the first Shell oil site discovered. So the roots of Shell is in North Sumatra, but it was destroyed during the Japanese period, and especially during the Revolutionary War, and Shell never came back to it. There was questions also of the legality of that oil in the international market, because technically it was owned by Shell. But Sutowo developed business relations with an American oil company who then sort of put in their investments, sending people and equipment and stuff from California, go to this jungle in North Sumatra to recreate this bombed out facility. And by that year, by 1960, I think they were already exporting oil to the Japanese market. So what Sutowo had in comparison to what other Indonesian national oil companies, there were two other ones, didn't have, was this sort of business proficiency and an ability to develop relations with what's considered now called, or then called, like minor oil companies, different from the big oil companies of the Seven Sisters. Okay, So after the 1965 period and the rise of the New Order, Sutowo then were able to consolidate his control of Pertamina, and then Pertamina was amalgamated with other Indonesian national oil companies into Pertamina, and Pertamina by 1968 became like the only oil company. Yeah, it also developed a new form of oil relations with investors from Western oil company. It's called a production sharing contract, and the first form of production sharing contract was with an American company called IBRD. And this kind of production sharing contract is different from the concession system which had been in operations during the colonial period. This would be like the standard form for a lot of countries around the world. Like, you know, if you go to Malaysia, China, production sharing is a standard, and it was developed initially by Sutowo in the late 60s in the context of Pertamina. So by the 70s, even before the rise of price of oil in 73, oil had become the most dominant sector for investments or foreign investors in Indonesia. So primarily this was the result of Sutowo's very deft relationship with a lot of minor oil companies. So he had dozens of oil companies from the US, but from other countries as well, from Japan, from Europe, signing up PSC contracts and then developing oil. So it was one of the most it was one of the more significant oil investment areas globally. And by the time, as in 72, 73, China had risen to become actually a very significant oil company. It is the largest company in Asia outside of Japan, for instance, and at the time, and it represents, for instance, at its height, something like 80% of Indonesia's export value, and more than half of the government revenue all came from Pertamina, right? So as I said, by the early 70s, Indonesia's oil sector became one of the largest investment regions for oil, but also just so many people were coming in from the US and so forth. And as I said, since the 73 oil boom, it became one of the biggest corporations. And he was courted by bankers, he was courted by oilmen, these forms of investments were also pushed forth by people in the World Bank, the IMF, but particularly in the State Department, right? So bankers and oilmen were helped when going to Jakarta, meeting him and so forth, in order to help the process of investment there. So Sutowo controlled this massive flow of oil money. Now he always presented himself as a staunch nationalist. So he thinks that the oil money is for Indonesian development as part of this nationalization drive. And so he pushed a lot of investments based on Pertamina's revenue, but also primarily on the credit that he was getting, right? Because he was getting a lot of credit from a lot of banks for large industrialization projects, including a steel mill, fertilizer factory, and so forth, and for various other what's considered nationalist projects. So he developed an airline, hotel, and so forth. So Pertamina was becoming this conglomerate of various businesses. Now, as I said, this large inflow of dollar in control under Pertamina, under Ibnu Sutowo, if you look at the way in which Indonesia's corrupt political situation is, there's what's called an extra budgetary flow of money, right? And these are monies that are outside of the budget, that are given to Indonesian elites, or if they need a project or something, or it's basically a flow greasing up the political spectrum. And this happens in all kinds of industry, but particularly just the size of Pertamina alone has resulted in just this massive amounts of, and the rise of Pertamina as a very important politically central position in Indonesian society. So corruption has been an issue that's sort of discussed during the, especially after 65, especially by 1968, 69, especially 70s, there were like student demonstrations on corruption and so forth. And corruption became like a really major issue, something which I think Suharto wasn't, the president of Indonesia after Sukarno, wasn't very interested in, but was forced to address. In 1970, for instance, in the national, the Independence Day address, it was about corruption. And in 1970, Suharto instituted a what's called a commission of four, which sort of studied conditions of corruption in Indonesia at the time, and then made a report on suggestions of how to fix the issues. So students and newspapers in particular were calling, were really voicing these kind of problems surrounding corruption. And Ibnu Sutowo, despite being the nationalist, actually became sort of like the poster child of this kind of corruption and immorality that sort of permeates the airwaves in the context of Indonesian society. So you can see lots of student demonstrations, turunkan harga minyak general, lower the price of oil general, and what the general means here is actually Sutowo himself. So he was a major public figure and a sort of icon of the problems surrounding New Order corruption by the 70s, right? Especially later on after 73 when Pertamina became such a big company in Indonesia. So, okay, so that's one side of the story is on the oil sector. But this chapter or this paper I'm writing is about the clash between the technocrats and the oil sector. Right? It's really about the clash between Ibnu Sutowo and the technocrats. And primarily it's about the question of who controls the oil money, right? Because as I said, large amounts of dollar is now entering into Indonesia, but it's under the aegis of Ibnu Sutowo. So the Indonesian technocracy has always been sort of, obviously we're aware of the importance of oil money since the late 60s. Oil has always been one of the primary industry in Indonesia. Now in 1968, the technocrats had tried to take over the company through the Ministry of Mines. Technically, Pertamina was under the Ministry of Mines, but the way in which Ibnu Sutowo operated, he acted almost as if he was independent of, and people, in the State Department reports and stuff like that, see that it's a state within a state, right? So Indonesian government was actually basically two forms: one controlled by the technocrats, the other one controlled by Ibnu Sutowo and the Pertamina. And primarily why Sutowo was able to do that, first of all, he was providing a lot of extra budgetary money, right, to a lot of Indonesian elites, including to President Suharto. But also, Suharto had a lot of confidence in him. And not just Suharto, actually, quite a lot of people in the World Bank, in the IMF, also had, and in the embassy, also thinks that this guy, Ibnu Sutowo, was there primarily because Sutowo was a relatively good manager. He could, develop relations with a lot of oil companies and make it happen in a way that maybe technocrats who aren't businessmen, who are just, are economists, may not be able to do so. Now, but this rise in anti-Ibnu Sutowo, anti-Pertamina in relation to corruption, the discourse in society, did force Suharto then to sort of push the issue of trying to reduce corruption, Pertamina, and in 1971, a new Pertamina law was inaugurated, which sort of placed the company under a commissioner that included people in the planning office, the Babanas, the center of the Indonesian technocracy, in the Ministry of Mining, in the Ministry of Finance. All of that was part of the technocracy. And allegations of corruption had also resulted in Suharto sort of pushing for appointing 20 state auditors to start trying to piecemeal what exactly is the entire flow of Pertamina's credits and monetary relations, right? Because it became so big and that there was no full understanding. The state didn't really fully understand what was happening. So a clash between technocrats and Ibnu Sutowo was in a way underway, right? Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indonesian technocracy. So the Indonesian technocracy, for the most part, they were trained at the Faculty of Economics at UI, University of Indonesia in Jakarta. But then they did their postgraduate studies in several U.S. universities, but primarily in Berkeley, California. Right? So it was the famous article on the Berkeley Mafia, the idea. So it's somewhat similar to like the Chicago Boys in Chile. So the Berkeley Mafia is the one that sort of spearheaded the neoliberal kind of agenda in Indonesia. But I guess in that sense, maybe it's not as neoliberal as we think. Well, that's probably one of my conclusions. So they developed good relations with who would become President Suharto since the early 60s, when some of them taught at the Indonesian Army Staff and Command School in Bandung. And their main source of legitimacy was post-1966, in which they had managed to reduce the amount of inflation that Indonesia was suffering under. So by 1965, under President Sukarno's chaotic economic policy making, inflation was hyperinflation, 600%, right? And in just less than a couple of years, they've managed to significantly reduce the amount and to less than 10% by 1970. I think 71 it was only 2 point something percent. It was incredibly low for Indonesia at the time. It would rise again as a result of the rise of oil money coming in, but primarily why the technocrats were able to do that was, well, of course they did enforce policies, but also very importantly, they had the support of major organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and the US, and a lot of Western countries who sort of pulled into what was called the IGGI, the Inter-Governmental Group on Indonesia. And so they provided significant amount of money, which would allow for the Indonesian government to run a policy that's called a balanced budget, in which technically it doesn't, the Indonesian government doesn't do any, what do you call that, deficit financing, so that it doesn't result in inflation, and that continued up until the end of the Suharto period. So by the time IGI was absolved in 1992, over $40 billion was given to Indonesia at the time just to maintain a stable non-inflationary environment. So, but I think, and there's quite a major shift in the context of Indonesia and the aid world, right? Because Indonesia was a basket case in the 60s. Under Sukarno, it was considered as the biggest failing economy in the world. And by 1970, Indonesia was one of the most poorest areas in the world. It was like the 5th poorest country on earth, right? It had a GDP per capita around $60 at the time. But it became also a sort of a holy grail, or a place where, okay, this is where a testament, or this is where we're going to show that Western aid works, right? So in 1968, Robert McNamara visited Indonesia as the first country he visited when he was appointed as the head of the World Bank. And then he was convinced in Indonesia. He met with the technocrats. He met with Suharto. He says that no other country I've ever visited, particularly in Southeast Asia, has a sounder approach to its economic problems, backed by so many resources as Indonesia, and in no other country are top men responsible for the nation's economy so well qualified as in Indonesia. Anyway, what I want to say is that as a result of this, the World Bank before that operated differently. Before McNamara, under McNamara, it operated as a sort of a developmental institution, and in order to do that, it had to sort of become more engaged in the country. And Indonesia had the first country chapter of the World Bank and the largest country chapter of the World Bank under Bernard Belt, who had been in Indonesia for decades. But not only that, but the IMF operation in Indonesia was also the largest IMF operation in the world, and the State Department also employed a significant amount, something like 20 to up to 40 people in the American embassy in Indonesia to help with Indonesian economy. So it was a big operation to show that we can change this basket case into an example of development through the aid sector. So the relationship between the technocrats and these organizations, whether in the State Department and IMF and World Bank, was very good, right? Okay, so one of the more here's where I think it becomes quite interesting is that after the Pertamina law was launched in '71, there were concerns already bubbling up, especially by '72, about the reckless taking of credit by Pertamina in a way that's not, and that a lot of it is not fully understood by people in Jakarta or in Washington. But several cases came up in which credit was above the credit ceiling that the IMF had sort of imposed in Indonesia in '72. But what happened is that I think the technocrats and the IMF sort of worked together to limit Pertamina's credit ceiling. Now, so in '72, it was then the IMF forced the Indian government to force Pertamina to stop any mid or midterm, short or long-term or credit. And then what happened? Ibnu Sutowo began taking short-term credits within the development of what's called the euro-dollar credit market. So, and this is where there's a shift in the way credit markets were operating at the time, because previous to the oil crisis, much of what's within the credit markets were national credit markets, right? Within the Keynesian system, it was very important for credits to be controlled by national governments. But in the 70s, and this is part of the financialization, the shift towards neoliberalism, is that there emerged a non-national or a global credit market. And initially, one of the more important ones of these credit markets were what's called the euro dollar. And these euro dollars are dollars that were sent to Europe for Marshall Plan that wasn't being used. And so there was a pool of dollars in Europe, which is then taken by some banks to be loaned in a way that's outside of national credit systems, right? So nowadays it's very common because it's credit is international now, but in the 70s this was something quite new. But in any case, these kind of credit markets are very unregulated, and the way Ibnu do it is that because these are short term, it's called 365-day credit. So credits are under a year. Is that he would then roll over the credit by taking over other credits, right? So it was a very reckless kind of thing. But in a way, it's easy for him to do that because so many bankers were coming to him, telling, "Oh, I'll give you credit." Okay, let me just maybe I'm too okay. So I guess this story is a bit more knowledgeable for people who reads this kind of stuff. In 1975, Pertamina failed to pay a loan of around $40 million to the National Bank of Dallas. And the National Bank of Dallas, it was part of that of a euro-dollar credit syndicate with what's called the cross default clause. So they had like maybe 20 banks there giving credits, but if one bank don't get their loan back, all the banks will take their loan, right? So it became immediately a systemic issue. And both the IMF, the World Bank, and the Indonesian, the American embassy in Indonesia, and the technocracy were alerted with this probability. And this, because the scale of Pertamina's credit was something that's not really known by, so nobody knows how much credit was taken by Pertamina. There was already in 1975 rumors of a global credit, expanding credit crisis. So it wasn't just an Indonesian problem; it was a global problem, and the embassy and the IMF talked to, they invited bankers, also Pertamina invited bankers to sort of please don't take the loan and stuff like that. So it was an international operation. In any case, what resulted is the loss of Pertamina's of Ibnu Sutowo's control of Pertamina, right? So the Indonesian government stepped in, and a lot of the projects Pertamina was shelved or stuff like that were taken over to other parts of the government. An international auditing company, I think it was Ernst & Young or something, was requested to try and solve this credit issue in Pertamina, and they found that Pertamina had something like maybe an estimate of around $10.5 billion worth of credit, which was massive in that period, because it was a quarter of the total credit of Southeast Asia at the time, and it was several times total debt of Indonesia's historical debt. So Indonesia's historical debt, including the debt of the Netherlands, Indies, and the debt incurred with Soviet Union and stuff under Sukarno, had only amassed something like less than $3 billion. So this was like a ballooning situation. Okay. So not only that, but scandals arose, right? When Pertamina's issues came to the fore, a number of scandals arose which showed just the way in which. So one of this, maybe I'm just gonna. But in any case, this guy Bruce Rappaport worked with Ibnu Sutowo, met with him in a nightclub actually in Switzerland, and he signed 1,400 promissory notes, which Ibnu says, oh, he's not going to use for it. It's just he needs to get money from, and then after Pertamina went bankrupt in '75, his company came in and says, oh, you owe us $3.3 billion worth of, right? And then the Indonesian government was like, and then they did succeed in reducing the amount because it was all just fake stuff. A lot of these are fake stuff. But the Indonesian state gave $150 million to Rappaport just so that he would not pursue the case. And he's done this a lot of time actually. And he was part of the BCCI credit crisis in New York in the 80s and 90s. And so his relationship with CIA and with, so you have these people who are interesting, who saw Ibnu as a person who you can, approach and develop these kind of relations. So anyway, okay, maybe I'll just, because I'm too long. So the effects of the Pertamina crash, the control of oil resources and money flow from Ibnu Sutowo to the technocrats. So afterwards, a lot of the money went back to the technocrats, and that really did focus on pro-poor investments in the 70s and 80s, which, as we know, that created a layer of middle class, which were important later on for the shift towards industrialization in Indonesia in the 80s. Also, Pertamina's crash reduced the inflationary expansion due to expanding credit investment. So much of that money had to pay for, instead of going into the economy, they had to pay for, like someone like Rappaport, they pay 100 million, 50 million for him, but also a lot of other stuff. So it retarded Indonesia's financialization until the post-oil boom between 1982 and 86, when oil price was significantly depressed, and when the technocracy then implemented the regulation that would then push for the industrialization in the 80s in Indonesia. Pertamina itself became more regulated and less dynamic, so it sort of fell off the radar screen. So if you think about the 70s, as Pertamina is this huge, as almost a really big multinational corporation, now it's nothing, right? So this shift is part of that. So Pertamina's cash was really good for Indonesia because it maintained relatively low inflation. It kept up again in 73, 74 as a result of the rise of oil price. But then the collapse depressed it. It limited investments into large-scale industry. And so Indonesia did not have the credit crisis that a lot of other countries in the South, especially in Latin America, did. Right? A lot of countries became bankrupt in Mexico, Argentina, places like that. Because the commodity boom in the 70s, they were just pulling all that money into industrialization, just like what Sutowo did, but I guess Sutowo reined it in because he collapsed in 75. Okay. So, okay, let me just go down. So, I guess the question it's also about talking about how exactly can we write about U.S. empire in a different way, right? As I said, the combined IMF, World Bank, and State Department experts working in Jakarta is one of the largest in the world in the 70s upwards. Yeah, and so no other countries has a kind of aid resource. Maybe not no other countries, but in the South, in the global South, working in and on Indonesia. And in the State Department's main role in that was to help American investors, actually. So someone like Ellen Higginbottom in the State Department worked in 75 to 75 as part of the economics section, helped expand from 50 to 450 American investors in various industries. And many of those that work in the State Department or in after their terms of service, they can then shift towards the industries that they helped create in Indonesia, right? For instance, the ambassador in the early 70s, Francis Galbraith, after he finished his terms as ambassador, he worked for Bechtel, Warehouse, and Freeport in Indonesia for these kind of. So you see it a lot, and including Ibnu Sutowo, people in Indonesia. So it's not like there's an Indonesian component and a Western component. So people were moving about within this space, right? Space of as a result of the development of investments in the 70s. Okay, so the idea is to then think of within this context of American imperial circuit, the presence of what I might term as transnational entrepreneur. And Ibnu Sutowo is actually that. He was very much a transnational man. He was a member of lots of country clubs in California and Texas. When he met first time with Robert McNamara, he didn't meet him when McNamara came in '68, but he did met him in 1970 in Washington D.C. He went to McNamara's office, but he was there with the former governor of California. So there's close relations, which I think maybe is something which is much more prevalent in the 70s than today, for instance, where these kind of relations, transnational ones, sort of emerged due to opportunities, right? The rise of opportunities of oil. So I guess what the research wants to complicate, and maybe later on, is first of all to understand American empire in Indonesia, in the late 20th century in the context of neoliberalism. To look at oil assemblage and political relations within the context of that empire, particularly, right? So, talking about Ibnu Sutowo as not an Indonesian agent, but as part of that transnational agent, and then to sort of go beyond the methodological nationalism in which a lot of people, when they analyze about Indonesia, they focus on Indonesian oligarchy or patronage or extraction, but within this national context. I think if you look at oil, it doesn't really make sense. It's always been somewhat transnational, whether it's with criminals like Rapaport or with people in the World Bank or in the State Department. And in the context of the wider book, so I'm also going to talk about the emergence of oil and people like Hendrikus Polijn, who was once headed the Royal Dutch Shell, but he was also secretary of Governor General Van Huyts when Van Huyts was conquering Aceh, Sumatra, right? He was the conqueror of Sumatra. Polijn was his second man. He was the secretary in developing the outer island local government. And then he later on became the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He also became the what do you call it, the Ministry of Colony. So if you look at, again, also in the colonial period, people in government or in business, there was no separation. They were going all over the place. And it was always transnational in that sense. It was in Amsterdam and The Hague, London and in Indonesia. So, so in that sense, it's while it's discussing about Indonesian oil company, Ibnu Sutowo prominently there, it's also trying to understand neoliberalism as a phenomena, not just in the context of financialization, and a lot of that discussion is very much Western-based, Western-centered, right? Focus on New York and how that sort of shifted. But also trying to complicate Indonesia's position within the context of the American Empire, and just sort of discussing the structure and institutions of frontier extractions, which allow monopolies of resources and their connection to global flows, particularly credit and money, which isn't only a neoliberal phenomenon, but is part of it, but which is a prominent case in understanding the 70s in the transition towards the neoliberal era. And thus, I guess the book is also, it's a book about oil history, but also about allowing us to sort of think of rewriting the new order as part of that sort of global history or global circuits. So, yeah, thank you very much.